to Reclaim You. This is our first episode. Reclaim You is for folks who have experienced trauma or disordered eating and are working towards reclaiming themselves in the wake of all that can cause. So today we're starting out chatting with Casey, the amazing Casey.
Hey.
Hey. Casey is an eating disorder, trauma, and grief specialist at Reclaim Therapy. And today we're going to dig into a little bit about diet culture, its origins, its history, all of that really important stuff that, we talk about with clients a lot and can be really supportive of helping folks reclaim themselves after struggling with food and body stuff for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Casey, Reclaim You. Start out by, what does that phrase mean to you in your life or in your work with clients? What does Reclaim You? Yeah, what does it mean to you?
I feel like it's such a big question. I think the idea of reclaiming myself didn't really happen until I graduated college.
Mhm.
And I think it was this really stark realization that hey, I'm in charge of my own life.
Mm.
And I was so mega confused as to what that actually looked like.
Yeah.
Right. And I think being able to have some time before I started delving into therapy work to really think about what happened the last 22 years of my life, right? What happened?
How did I get here?
Did I get here? Right.
Yeah.
And I think, in doing this work and then thinking back to what I was reflecting on at that time in my life, I never knew how impacted I was from the outside world. And that sounds like, duh, right? But I can think all the way back to grade school. And we were still doing the Got Milk commercials and the food pyramid and
Yeah.
all of that stuff. And that was just normal, right? And then it went on to high school, right? And that's where things really start to do this, act like this, don't do this. And I remember a big thing in figuring out how I wanted to show up for myself in the world was realizing how much I compensated for my body. So being in a bigger body for most of my life, I felt like I needed to compensate by being really intelligent or, being really quiet and, all of these things where I tried to take up less space, but also try and overcompensate just as a being, right? And doing this work, obviously, that goes back to my self-worth and all of those things. But the thing that scared me the most was that was normal. I was just oh yeah, I just have to show up in other ways, right?
Yeah.
And
Normal and almost expected, right?
right.
Yeah.
And oh, you're just the quiet one, or you're the smart one, right? And I didn't fall too much into wanting to fit in, but I think I tried really hard to just isolate myself considering I didn't fit in, right? And thinking about all of the crazy diets that people were on in high school and just the way people felt like they needed to be was just, it's mind-boggling looking back at it now, but scary how normal that was.
Yeah.
And at that time, right, social media was just beginning to flourish, right?
It was just blossoming. Yeah.
So I was in this really weird period where there was no technology, and then all of a sudden it just skyrocketed, right?
Flashed. Yeah.
And that's really where this perception of how you had to be and how you needed to present and how you needed to show up in the world. And then in college, you're an adult, like life shows up, right? And I think the thing that hit me the most was like this hustle culture and this fear mongering of like, you need to get your shit together, like you need to
Have
just
it all
figure
figured
this
out.
out.
Uh,
I'm like, this is too much, right? So I remember like the first 6 months after I graduated college was like really awful for me.
mm,
I didn't know what I wanted to do, what I could do. Um, I just felt like shit about myself. And I
mhm,
remember just taking that time to be like, what do I want to do? Like, really, it's an opportunity. And I think
mm,
that flipping the script, right? Um, and so delving into therapy work, like that became another part of me, right?
mm.
And that opportunity to explore. And then the pandemic hit, which
Yeah.
then rewired like reframed everything that
E-
people thought, right?
Everything about everything.
Everything, right? And so I remember the the biggest change, and it sounds silly, but like it was monumental for me, was I just stopped wearing makeup. I
Mm,
just stopped. Like
mm.
cold turkey. And listen, I followed every beauty guru, beauty influencer, like spent thousands of dollars, looking back at it to do what? I don't know, to fit in, to feel safe, to feel contained.
Find I belong.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And really that snowballed. I stopped dyeing my hair. I stopped, wearing clothes that I didn't feel aligned with. Um, I feel like I gravitate towards a more masculine presentation, and that feels good for me. But never in my life did I feel safe to do that in my past life,
Yeah.
and so that then snowballed into like, what am I interested in? What are my passions? Like I think it just takes that little step that definitely feels scary and feels risky, right? But doing it in a safe container and having support, and to the point I am today where I can like show up in the world and I can be like not the smartest
Mm,
and not the most successful and not the richest, and like it doesn't matter,
mhm,
right? Like my worth comes from inside. It comes from this relationship I built with myself.
mhm,
So that's my story.
mm.
And, when I think about how it shows up for clients, it's just like the work that we do, we can really understand what that feels like, right? To normalize the idea that you do things to feel safe. And whether safe is fitting in or blending in or hiding or escaping, and the idea of the fact that you have all these things inside of you already, right?
Mm.
Like they just
Yeah.
haven't been found yet.
Mhm,
And so learning how to be authentic,
mhm,
whatever that is, whether that's I have no idea what I want, whether that's like I want to try this thing and I'm scared,
yeah.
whether that's like I hate this thing that I do, but I do it because, I'm scared of the repercussions of not, good, bad, or indifferent, like
Yeah.
showing up authentically is really hard in the world we live in today.
It is. Yeah.
So that's like my main take point from my life is, to explore what being authentic means, and that's already there. It's just hidden by all this bullshit, you know?
Yeah. Totally. Totally. Yeah. So speaking of bullshit, diet culture. So
Really?
really, really, yeah.
I love it.
Um, when you first started reading or learning about diet culture,
Mhm,
what stood out to you the most? Because that feels so important in this like journey that we're
mhm,
always on of like reclaiming ourselves in the
mhm.
face of all this shit, our histories and then the cultural influences and all of that. But when you first started concretely learning about diet culture, like what was it? What was like, oh, like shit.
Mm, mm. There's a couple things. I mean, I think that just the fear mongering really like was front and center for me. because I remember, growing up in the 90s, obesity was a disease, right? Like, save your children, like, save your family. And interestingly enough, at that same time that this was really skyrocketing, it was, like, the war on terror was starting, and like all of this, just like, it was so interesting, the fear in politics and the world we live in felt almost just the same as this like war on obesity, right? And so that was really stuck out for me, like the medical model and how people really use it to fearmonger people into like, I am not doing this right. Like, I need to get my shit together. Like, I need to be here for my kids, all of that stuff. Um,
I should have control
and
over this, right?
yes, just like contain you, right? I mean, I think, in reading more about like the oppressive side of diet culture, realizing that, in moments of liberation and, political freedom, is right when society tended to say, no, this is the standard now, right? Like, you're not enough. And I mean, I really think this is the response to keep people contained, right? And the idea that in reality, society can literally contain and control a population based on not enoughness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like, that just blew my mind. And I, like everybody does, right? I'm like, no, that
When you
never
read it,
happened
it's
to
like,
me.
what? Yeah.
Like, that never happened to me. I was above that. And then I look back at all of my life and I'm like, no, it wasn't. It absolutely wasn't.
Yeah.
And, I think to realize that every single person is touched by diet culture
Yeah.
is astounding too.
Mhm.
So I think they're the things that stood out for me. I mean, obviously the crazy diets and like just the things that people will do to feel enough and to feel like they're doing the right thing, right? Wild.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we use the word diet culture, um, it's everywhere, right? It's all over. And thank goodness for that. Thanks, like things are
Yes.
growing, on social media and all of those things, which is wonderful. I think people get confused about like, well, what is diet culture? So when we use the term for you, like what does diet culture mean? What does that phrase kind of represent?
Mm, yeah. I mean, I think, the main thing that I explain to people is diet culture doesn't necessarily mean that you are following a quintessential diet, right? It's a culture. And I think I really try to tell people that the focus is on the culture of it, right? Because that's where you get the nuances and the hidden messages and all of those things. So I think the main points is that thinness is ideal, right? Like, that is a moral standing, a virtue, like a place to be esteemed. And if you are, then you're in good standing or you're like healthy or whatever.
Enough.
Um,
Yeah.
enough, right? Which, if we just all reclaimed ourselves, we would all eventually feel enough. And that's just part of the journey.
Uh-huh.
Um, I mean, I think, and with that ideal is we're all scrambling to figure out how to do that, right? And so there's polarizing and demonizing of how people eat, if they're eating, enough, or types of food, or what time of the day, or whatever, right? That you're a bad person if you eat this, or you are a good person and working on yourself, quote unquote, if you eat these foods. So
Yeah.
definitely like a demonizing and a hypervigilance to, am I doing the right thing?
Huh.
Right. And then, overall, just an oppressive environment for people who don't align with that for whatever reason. Right. Um, and I think, that has definitely been something that's spoken of more, which I appreciate, is like naturally, because everybody is different. And that's normal and okay. that naturally this is something to oppress people. And as we try and grow the anti-diet, anti-fat phobia movement, like we need to come together as all bodies, right? And I think even the liberation, there is some diet culture stuck in there, right? Of
Mhm.
this separate nature and all of that. So mainly thinness is ideal, hypervigilance and demonizing of foods, and just the oppressive nature of that thin ideal. And that just is an umbrella for so many different pieces of this, but
Yeah. Yeah. And so the origins of diet culture, from what you know, or what you've read or listened to or researched and all of those things, talk a little bit, if you can, about some of the origins of where this started.
mm, this is my favorite question.
This is your jam. This is
This
your
is
jam.
my jam. This is my jam because it spans for hundreds of years. I mean, first things that I have like noticed is like ancient Greece, right? Before ancient Greece, where there was, no transportation and no food preservation, right? Like everybody, fed themselves through the seasons. There was no other options. You either survived or you didn't, right? Um, and then once, food preservation and transportation were available and there was more options for food, then people started to think like, oh, I have choice, right?
Mm.
Like, and what's that look like for me? And, looking towards the future, powers that be will take advantage of any choice you have and give you
Mhm.
none, right? So
Mhm.
ancient Greece was where the ideal body first developed, from my understanding. Um,
Mhm.
and what's interesting is that it wasn't about, you know, the physical shape or physical presentation of someone, but it was of their physical ability.
Mm.
And I just think that's really interesting in looking at how we look at intuitive movement today and like the focus on, celebrating your abilities, right? And being strong and feeling good in your body internally. That's what the Greeks celebrated, which I think
Mm.
is just fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, the first diet book was made in the 1500s,
Wow.
which I think is fascinating. And the title was it, The Art of Living Long.
Wow.
So we're already in this mindset, right? Of like what you put in your body. Like there's nothing talked about like the mind at all, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And that was, the idea of, people didn't live past 30. So living to 40 or 45 was huge, right?
Right. Mhm.
And 100 years later, about um, a book was written that was called like Fruits, Herbs, and Vegetables in like 1620. And it demonized the dairy and meat and sugar consumption of the British.
Mm.
So at that point, we're already leaning into this demonizing of food, right? Um, which I didn't delve too much into to say, like, is that what they have access to? Like, is that what's available?
Yeah.
Which, if we bring that all the way back here, right, that food deserts and food insecurity are demonized by diet culture that doesn't give a shit what your financial situation is or what your availability is.
Have access to.
Which, yeah, which to say it happens in 1600s, like that just blows my
Uh-huh.
mind. Blows my
Uh-huh.
mind.
Yeah.
So then you're going into like the 1800s. And during the 1800s, right, like because food preservation and transportation really started to kick into gear and people had more access to it, that they then demonized people not having those things, right?
Mhm.
So if you didn't have those things, you weren't having as much nutrition. And so looking at somebody who has those things and could give themselves nutrients more often, being in a bigger body meant higher status.
Mm.
It meant, you were more financially inept, right? And then that kept going, but there were starting to be these inklings of this thinness ideal.
Mm.
And it started with this man, Lord Byron, who was the first like diet influencer. And he started the vinegar diet, which we now know today is like those apple cider,
Cider crap.
cayenne pepper bullshit,
Yeah.
right? Taste awful and make you sick to your stomach,
Acidic
honestly.
stuff, right? Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
you don't want it. And before he had started the vinegar diet, he was actually in a restrict binge cycle, and talked about that throughout his like, goings on in his life. And actually, there was a high amount of women who had unfortunately passed away from drinking excess amounts of vinegar. Right? So you're seeing in around like 1820s, where people are literally dying for this ideal, which is just crazy. And then you have like a little bit afterwards, you have the first low carb diet, which we now know paleo, Atkins, the caveman diet. That's where it came from. This idea of carbs are bad, right?
Yeah.
Which I just think it's fascinating that the history is now just again repeating itself, right? This information is not new. The scary part is that there is more access to knowing about it and getting yourself in that dark hole, which wasn't there in the 1800s, right? So 1860s, there was a UK weight loss guru, William Bending, and he had created a pamphlet about his weight loss journey, recipes and restrictions and what you can and can't eat, sold out multiple times.
Mhm.
So you're already getting this energy, right? That people are seeking this information, right?
Yeah.
So there's a little break in between. And then you get flapper culture, right? In the 1920s, where this is where I think, again, just from the information that I have, that this is really when the idea of clothes determining how people's bodies should look came to fruition, right? And the penny scales came out, which just to think about, they still existed when I was growing up, the penny scales. And just the idea that I always tell my clients, right, that like what little money, particularly, women had back then, they would use to participate in using a scale.
Mm-hmm.
I feel so sad. Like that immediately like breaks my heart. And so 1920s flapper culture, then obviously you get the BMI that was created in the early 1900s, which for everybody watching is statistical collection, not supposed to be used for medical information.
Yeah,
I'm
I'll link
sure.
our blog post on it. Yeah, the
Good.
race of the BMI and how it's all just epic bullshit.
Yes. So that really, then you get like boom, 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 diet culture everywhere, right? So in the 1930s, you have the first weight loss medication. In the 1940s, speed was encouraged to be used for weight loss. Then you have in the 1950s bariatric surgery. You have the discussion of morbid obesity, right? So this idea of, again, the fear-mongering perspective that death is imminent, which obviously for people who are getting very little information, we're still not at the tech savvy era that people are, oh my God, I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
Let's get this together, right?
Yeah.
I have to do something. And then you get this twist, right? Of Jenny Craig came out in the 1960s, which then led to this influx of like food associated 12-step programs. Fatties Anonymous, Gluttonous Anonymous. So just the names, right, that we're coming out with is just like, you're a bad person, you did a bad thing, you need to get your shit together, bada, bada, bada. And then 1970s pop up and you have civil rights, you have anti-war protests, you have all of that. And as I said before, when you get all that liberation, right, then the powers that be want to go, no, you're not allowed to have that. So this is why you're not enough. And this is why you feel like shit about yourself, right? So then Atkins came out, Jenny Craig, the whole, and again, we're getting more books, we're getting more VHS tapes at that time, we're getting, more influx of information, those shitty, what are they? The things that you see in the grocery store, those little magazines that are like, lose, bada, 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 right?
Yeah, like the
They
tabloids.
started coming out. Tabloids, that's what they're called, right?
Yeah.
And then the medical model starts showing up in this, right? So you have the National Institute of Health in 1992 coming out and saying, like, yeah, diets are not sustainable. But 2 years later, you have nutrition facts being required,
Yeah.
right? And then in 2013, obesity was deemed a disease. So again, that really just creates this environment that we have today where every doctor you see, every specialist you see is invested in your health by commenting on your weight. And if you're seeing this or hearing this in just audio, there's quotations everywhere in what I'm saying. So yeah, I find the journey so fascinating because of the parallels in different time periods and how quickly things change, right?
Yeah.
It's just wild.
It is wild how it just kind of shape shifts over time. Yeah.
And just
Totally.
quickly, right? But yeah, that stuff is fascinating and spans over hundreds and hundreds of years, but you didn't get the concentration of it until probably early 1800s, late 1900s, or I mean, early 1900s.
Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I feel like we could do also, to add on to that, a whole other like episode on how race definitely 100% plays into all of this. There's the thin white and where that came from and the roots and the origins and all of that kind of stuff and how this like shape shifting since, what did you say, the 1500s? The 1500s, right? Like how the intersections are all there. I mean, that should definitely be a whole other episode for sure.
Yeah,
But
that's coming.
yeah, totally. So yeah, it's really, really fascinating stuff. Really fascinating stuff. Yeah. Yeah. And important for people to know as they're like getting to know what gut diet culture is and to like be on the lookout for the next shape shift. Like what's coming? How has it formed and weaved itself in and out of our society for so long and like keeping your eyes open for what's next. What's next?
Right. And it also normalizes this idea of, when somebody comes into our space and says, like, I've tried every which way and this, that, and the third. And it's like, yeah, you're going to, if this keeps continuing, you're never going to be enough. Like, you're never going to be enough in the eyes of society because body ideal has changed so many freaking times, right? And I think that really gives people that space to be like, oh yeah, this is bullshit, right? Like we went from, Kim Kardashian to heroin chic in a matter of like 6 months.
I know it was like a day.
It was honestly, I was
not
giving
very tuned in, but it felt like a day.
It almost was, right? And so when you look at it that way, you can't help but you can't unknow it now. You're like, oh, okay, like obviously this is bullshit. So yeah, it's just wild.
Yeah. What have been the most helpful or supportive resources for you as you've done this work and as you continue to kind of find resources for folks that you work with and all of that? What are the standout resources for you? Maybe we can make a little list for people to kind of tap into.
Yeah. I mean, the first things that I give people normally are Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison with the adjacent Food Site podcast. I think that gives a variety of different perspective for people who are just delving in. Um, I also think that the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health, in terms of delving into the medical forced connection between all of this, and they have really great health fact sheets
Yeah.
to talk about like the quintessential, medical model, weight focused things in society today. Um, the body's not an apology really starts delving into the oppressive nature of fat phobia and diet culture. Um, I mean, I think they're like my top. I think the Body Grievers Club is really good. Body Image by Brie in terms of dealing with like body grief and stuff. So there's a lot of resources. We'll put some information available to everybody because there's just so many to name,
I know there's so many to name. Yeah.
which is wonderful. Like, let's just acknowledge that that's so dope.
Thank goodness it kind of helps folks stay resilient and kind of keep their eyes open to noticing when things creep in, because we're swimming in it all day, right? Like resilience is important and things are going to sneak in, and it's being able to kind of like, whoa, like, oh, there that is, like, let me put it back where it belongs.
Yes, yes. And the inclusiveness of some of the beliefs, right? Like being able to see somebody say like F diet culture, that shit's bonkers. And you can say like, oh my gosh, really? Okay. I think that moves mountains in the beginning, is just associating yourself with spaces that start to question this stuff.
Yeah.
So we have plenty of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a slow kind of build lots of times, I think. And once you see it, you can't unsee it for the most part. Thank goodness for that.
Which is great.
It is. Okay. What do you feel like are your parting words about diet culture? Anything else that you want to share about diet culture with folks that could be helpful or supportive?
Mm. Succumbing to diet culture is normal,
Mm, yeah.
and diet culture sucks,
Yeah.
but be in spaces where questioning is happening and you will reclaim yourself.
Love it.
My
Love
parting
it.
words.
Thank you, Casey.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, everybody. We'll be back next week talking more about diet culture with Abby. So tune in next week and we'll talk to you then.
Bye, everybody.